cage dropped 600 feet into the earth at exactly 11:14 that night. And by the time it stopped, 3 men on the surface were already dead. I didn't know that yet. Nobody down there did. All I knew was that the phone at the bottom of the shaft, the one that connected us to the hoist operator up top, had gone dead in the middle of a sentence. My name is Earl Voss. I was 51 years old that night, and I'd spent 29 of those years underground at the Blackwater Number 4 mine, tucked into the folds of a mountain in Logan County, West Virginia. I knew that mine the way you know the inside of your own mouth with your tongue. I knew where it leaked and where it groaned, where the roof sagged low enough to take your hard hat off, and where the air went stale in the dead ends. I knew the sound of every machine before it broke and the smell of every seam we cut through. I had touched every rib and every timber and every stretch of that place with my own 2 hands over 3 decades. And there was not a foot of it that could surprise me. That was what I believed, anyway, standing there at the bottom of the shaft with the dead phone still warm in my hand. That there was nothing left in that mountain that could surprise me. What I didn't know was why Cole Rennick up top had said the word quarantine, and then stopped talking like somebody had reached over and grabbed his throat. I'd heard the shape of that silence before, in other men, in other rooms, but never over a mine phone at 11 at night, and never from Cole, who was the steadiest voice I'd ever heard on the other end of that line. I hung the phone back on its hook. The hook was bent from 30 years of men slamming the receiver down after a bad shift, and it wobbled the way it always did. And for a second, I stood there watching it wobble, because it was ordinary, and everything else had stopped being ordinary. Then I picked up the mine radio instead, and keyed it and called up. Nothing. Not static. Nothing. The kind of silence that means the other end isn't just having trouble hearing you. It means the other end isn't listening anymore. It means the other end isn't there. Behind me, down the crosscut, 7 other men were pulling on their gear for the graveyard shift, their lights swinging as they moved, throwing their shadows long and jumping against the coal. And they had no idea that the only way out of that mountain had just gone quiet. Before I take you the rest of the way down into that night, I want to say something plain. Thank you to everyone who keeps coming back for these stories. And if this is your first time here, welcome. If this kind of survival story is your kind of thing, subscribe, leave a comment, and stay with me, because it genuinely helps this channel keep going. Now let me get back to what happened underground. I want you to understand the shape of the place first, because the shape of it is the whole story. Everything that happened that night happened because of the shape of that mine. And if you don't see it the way I see it, you'll never understand why some men lived and some men didn't. A deep mine isn't a cave. People hear the word mine, and they picture a cave. Something natural, something that goes wherever the water and the rock decided it should go over 1,000,000 years. That's wrong, and the wrongness of it will kill you. A mine is engineered. It is a set of decisions made by men who came before you, men who are mostly dead now, and every one of those decisions is still down there working for you or against you, depending on the night. The Blackwater 4 was a room and pillar operation, which is the old way, the way that leaves the mountain mostly standing. It means the coal came out in a grid. Tunnels cut in one direction, crossed at right angles by tunnels cut in the other, so that from above, if you could peel the mountain back and look straight down, you'd see a checkerboard. And between every intersection of that checkerboard, they left a fat square pillar of solid coal standing to hold the mountain up over your head. Miles of it. A whole silent city of black stone corridors and black stone columns sitting under a ridge. breathing air that we forced down there with ventilation fans up top the size of a house. The pillars are the thing to understand. You are always, every second you are down there, standing under thousands of tons of rock that is only held up by columns of coal that men decided, decades ago, were fat enough to trust. Most nights, you don't think about it. You'd go crazy if you thought about it. But it's always there. The weight, patient. And the mind is always talking to you about it if you know how to listen. A creak, a pop from somewhere deep. A little rain of dust from the roof that means a bolt is working loose. You learn the mind's ordinary voice, all its ordinary complaints, so that when it says something new, you hear it right away. There is exactly one way that men go in and out of a mind like that under normal conditions. And that's the cage. It's an elevator, more or less, a steel box on a cable, riding up and down the main shaft. It's not fancy. It rattles. It's got a floor you can see the shaft through in the gaps. And old-timers used to make new men look down through those gaps on their first ride just to watch them go white. Above the cage, up on the surface, sits the hoist. The hoist is a drum the size of a grain silo winding steel rope thick as your wrist. And it's run by one man in a control room. And that man's whole job, his entire reason for existing during his shift, is to move that cage up and down the shaft and never, ever make a mistake. Because a mistake with the hoist means men falling 600 feet in the dark. That man was Cole Rennick. He was 58 years old. He'd run that hoist for 20 years, and he was the last voice I ever heard come down from the surface. There's a second way out, too. And I want you to hold on to this, plant it in your mind right now, because it becomes the whole world before the night is over. Every deep mine is required by law to have an escape way. A separate set of tunnels, kept clear, leading to a second opening at the surface, a long way from the first, with a set of stairs or a walkable slope, so that if the main shaft is on fire or flooded or the cage is broken, men can still get themselves out on their own 2 feet. Ours came up almost 2 miles away, on the far side of the ridge, at a portal we called the Sinkhole, because that's what the ground looked like around it. A slumping wet bowl of a place where the hillside had settled over old workings. Nobody ever used the sinkhole. It was a legal requirement. Walked and inspected once a month, and the other 29 days it just sat there in the dark. A promise the mine made to us. A promise that said, if everything else in the world fails you, there is still one more door, and it is always open, and it will always let you back into the light. That was the promise anyway. I'd checked it 100 times myself. I never once imagined the night. I'd stake 7 lives on it and find out what that promise was actually worth. That night, my crew was 8 men counting me. I want you to know them, all of them, because you're going to lose some of them before this is over. And it should mean something to you when you do. It meant everything to me. There was Boone Hatley, my shift foreman, 38 years old, built like a fire plug, short and thick and stubborn, a man who would argue with a fence post and consider it a win when the fence post gave up. Boone had a temper, but he had it on a leash most days. And there was nobody I'd rather have beside me when a thing went sideways, because Boone did not freeze. Whatever else you could say about him, he did not freeze. There was Del Pretty, the oldest of us at 59, close enough to retirement that he'd started talking about the trout stream behind his cousin's place, like it was a woman he was courting. Del was thin as a fence rail and quiet, and he'd lost his wife 3 years back to something in her blood the doctors named, but couldn't stop. He kept a photograph of her, a little one, laminated in plastic so the mine damp couldn't get it, tucked up inside the crown of his hard hat where it rode above his head all shift long. He said it was so she was always looking out for him. Nobody laughed at him for it. You didn't laugh at Del Pretty about anything, because in 40 years underground, the man had forgotten more about that mine than most of us would ever learn. There was a kid named Trace Odom, 23, 6 months in. Still scared of the dark in a way he worked hard to hide and never quite managed. You'd catch him keeping his light pointed a little too steady, breathing a little too careful, and you'd know. There's no shame in it. The dark down there is not the dark up top. It's a dark that has weight, that presses on you, that swallows your light 10 feet out and gives you nothing back. Every man who ever went underground was scared of it his first year. The ones who say they weren't are lying, and a man who'll lie about that will lie about worse. There was Sim Whitaker, our electrician, 45, the one man on the crew who could talk to every machine down there and get an answer back. Electricity in a wet mine is a thing that wants to kill you. And Sim had been shocked enough times over the years to respect it the way you respect a snake you've decided to keep in the house. He was calm the way men get calm when they've had their hair stood on end by 300 volts and lived. Nothing rattled Sim's hands. I'd seen him rewire a live panel by feel in the dark with water dripping down his collar, and never once curse. There was Rooster McGraw, whose given name I heard exactly once, on a piece of paperwork, and have since forgotten, because to every soul who ever knew him, he was Rooster. A barrel-chested loading machine operator with 4 arms like a blacksmith and a laugh you could feel through solid rock. A laugh that came up out of him like something escaping. Rooster made the long shifts bearable. When the coffee was cold and the roof was low and everybody's back hurt, Rooster would say some fool thing and the whole section would be laughing. And that laughter was worth more to a crew than any bonus the company ever paid. There was a section boss on loan from another crew, a lean, careful man named Hollis Pruitt, who'd transferred in from a mine over in Boone County about 2 weeks before. I didn't know Hollis well. He kept to himself, watched more than he talked, and did his job clean. Careful is the word I keep coming back to for Hollis. Every move he made was measured. In the days after, I came to understand that careful was exactly what saved certain men and doomed others, and that Hollis Pruitt had more steel in him than his quiet ever let on. And there was Garrett Sable. Garrett was the newest of us after Trace, come on maybe 4 months back. He was a wiry man in his early 40s with soft hands for a miner, which I noticed and didn't think much about, because men come to the coal from all kinds of lives. He had a way of watching everyone in a room without ever seeming to. A still, patient attention that I mistook for shyness. He said he'd worked mines out west, Colorado and Wyoming, hard rock and coal both, and that his wife's people were from around Logan, and they'd come back east to be close to family. It was a good story. It had the right details in it. He was pleasant to be around. He remembered your kids' names and asked after them. He always volunteered for the coffee run to the top when the cage was making a trip anyway. And he always seemed to know, off the top of his head, exactly how much charge was in the man-trip battery, and exactly which crosscut held which first aid cache, and exactly where every emergency supply in that section was kept. I liked him. I want to be honest about that with you, because the easy thing, the flattering thing, would be to tell you I always felt something off about the man. I didn't. I liked Garrett Sable fine. I liked him right up until the moment I stood over an empty steel box and understood what he'd done. And even now, telling it, I have to fight the memory of liking him. Because the liking is the worst part of the whole story. The dark that came into that mine didn't come in with teeth. It came in remembering my kids' names. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That night, when the phone went dead, I wasn't thinking about Garrett Sable at all. My first thought wasn't the end of the world. My first thought was electrical, because a deep mine loses communication now and then, and it's almost never anything worse than a pinched cable. Water gets into a junction box, a rat, and there are rats down there. Fat ones that ride the cage down in the feed sacks, chews through a line. A connection corrodes. You don't panic. You troubleshoot. That's the job. The mine is always trying to kill you in small, ordinary ways. And the men who last are the men who answer each small, ordinary problem, calmly, one at a time, without letting their imagination run ahead of the facts. "Sim," I called down the crosscut, and my voice came back to me flat off the coal the way it always did. "Phone's out and the radio's dead to the surface. Come give it a look." Sim Whitaker came out of the dark with his light bobbing, wiping his hands on the red rag he kept hanging out of his back pocket. He didn't hurry. Sim never hurried, and that was its own kind of comfort. He picked up the phone, listened, tapped the hook a few times, then set it down and worked the mine radio, keying it, checking the channel, all the small motions of a man who's done this 1,000 times. And I watched his face while he did it. And I watched his face do the thing where a man's confidence quietly stands up, puts on its coat, and leaves the room. "That's not our end," he said. He said it slow, like he was still checking it against everything he knew. "Our end's fine, Earl. Line's live all the way up the shaft. I can feel it. There's power on it. Something's off up top." He looked at me, and in the beam scatter of our two lamps, I could see him deciding how much to say. "The hoist signals are gone too. I can't get a bell answer." That stopped me cold. And I need you to understand why. Because it's the first real turn of the night. The bell signals are how you talk to the hoist operator. You pull a cord at the bottom of the shaft, a bell rings up in his control room, and he answers by ringing back. 1 ring for one thing, 2 for another, 3 to hoist men. It's the oldest, dumbest, most reliable system in the entire mine. It doesn't need software. It barely needs electricity. It has hung on that wall unchanged since before I was born, because nothing better has ever been invented for the one thing it does. If the bells were dead, then one of only 2 things was true. Either the signal line had been cut somewhere up in that 600 feet of shaft, which almost never happens, or there was nobody up top to answer them. "Ring for the cage," I said. "Full crew. We're going up to see what's what." Sim pulled the cord. 3 pulls, the signal to hoist men. I heard the bell ring, faint, up and away in the dark of the shaft above us. And then we all stopped and we listened. Sound does strange things underground. It carries in ways it shouldn't, and dies in ways it shouldn't. And every man in earshot went still and stopped breathing to listen for the far-off clank and groan of the hoist drum beginning to turn. That big machine up top starting to wind the cable and bring the cage down to us. Nothing turned. The mountain gave us back nothing but its own patient weight. Boone had come up beside me by then, chewing on the inside of his cheek the way he did when he was thinking, and didn't like his thoughts. "Maybe Cole stepped out," he said. "Bathroom. Grab a smoke. He does that on the slow runs. You know he does." He said quarantine, Boone. And then he stopped. Boone's chewing stopped. "Said what?" "Quarantine." And then it was like somebody reached over and grabbed him by the throat, mid-word. Boone didn't have anything to say to that. And you have to understand about Boone Hatley. The man always had something to say. He'd argue both sides of a thing just to keep his mouth moving. That silence from Boone, standing there in the dark with his light pointed at the floor, was worse than the dead radio. It was the first time all night I felt genuinely afraid, because a thing that could shut Boone up was a thing I didn't have a name for. So I did what a mind boss does when he doesn't have answers. I made a plan out loud, so that every man had something solid to hold on to besides the fear that was starting to move through us, like cold water finding the low places. I told them we'd take the man trip, our little battery-powered rail car, back down the tunnels to the bottom of the main shaft and set up there. If the cage came down, we'd be waiting, gear on, ready to load and ride. If it didn't come down, we'd give it 30 minutes, and then we would start toward the Sinkhole escapeway on the far side of the ridge and walk ourselves out of the mountain on our own feet. I said 30 minutes because that is the number the book says. And because a boss gives you a number even when the number is a lie, he's telling himself. The truth is, I already had a cold, sinking certainty growing in the middle of my chest. A certainty that told me the cage was not coming down. That Cole Rennick was not going to answer his bells. That whatever quarantine meant, it meant the surface had stopped being a place we could go. When you've been underground long enough, you develop something that isn't quite a sixth sense, but is close. A way of reading the mind's mood, the way an old sailor reads the sky. And that night, the mind felt like it was holding its breath, like it was watching us, like it knew something we hadn't caught up to yet. We loaded up. 8 men climbing into the man trip, light slicing the dark into moving slices, the electric motor waking up with its low hum and carrying us down the rail into the deeper black. I took the front seat, as I always did, Boone beside me, and somewhere in the loading, without a thought in my head about it, I registered that Garrett Sable had taken the very back seat of the car, the one nearest the tool cache and the emergency locker mounted at the rear. And I did not think one single thing about it. Men take the seat they take. The back seat is a fine place to ride if you don't like being crowded. I should have thought about it. I've had years to think about it since. But that night, it slid right past me, the way the most important things so often do, dressed up as nothing at all. The bottom of the main shaft is called the shaft station, and it's the closest thing a mine has to a lobby, a proper room. It's wide and it's high, hollowed out around the base of the cage, and it's brightly lit compared to the working tunnels, with real fixtures on the walls instead of just your headlamp. There are benches. There are lockers where men keep dry socks and lunch buckets. There's the phone and the bell pulls, and a big heavy steel gate that swings across the shaft opening so that no man in the dark ever walks straight into a 600-foot hole. The shaft station is where you feel safest underground, because it's the room where the way out lives. It's the last room before the world. That night, it was the first place I felt real, cold, animal fear, the kind that gets into your legs. We rolled in, and the cage was gone, which was normal. The cage lives up top between runs. But the shaft itself, the black column of it going up over our heads, was doing something I had never once heard in 29 years. Water was coming down. Not a leak, not the ordinary weep and drip of groundwater that's part of the background of any mine. A pour, a real falling column of it, splashing off the top of the steel gate and off the framing and pooling out across the station floor, spreading toward our boots. And it was warm. I crouched and put my bare hand into the spreading pool of it, and it was warm, blood warm, and it stank. It stank of something chemical and sharp and wrong, a smell like a public swimming pool crossed with burnt electrical insulation, a smell that had no business being anywhere near clean groundwater. "That's the fire suppression," Sim said behind me, and I heard him place the smell the same instant I did. "That's the deluge system, up in the hoist house on the surface. Something's tripped it. That's not water off the rock, Earl. That's the dump tanks emptying down the shaft. Fire? Trace's voice broke clean in half on the word. The kid was standing at the edge of the spreading pool with his boots right at the line of it, staring down like the warm water might reach up and take him by the ankles. Or somebody hit the manual dump, Sim said. And he said it slowly, working it out even as it came out of his mouth. The auto system trips off a heat sensor, but there's a manual release too. A big pull handle. And that's the thing, that's a handle. A person has to reach up and pull it. I stood there, with warm chemical water splashing down out of 600 feet of black, nothing between us and the sky. And I finally let myself think the thought I'd been holding at arm's length since the phone died mid-word. Somebody up top had triggered the mine's emergency systems, had said the word quarantine, and had gone silent. And now the only ordinary way out of that mountain was a wet, dark hole, with warm poison falling down it, and nothing at the top that we could trust to be there, or to be friendly if it was. I turned around. 8 lights, 7 men, all of them pointed at me, all of them waiting for me to be the thing I was supposed to be. And I made the second real decision of the night. The first one, the man trip, had been easy. This one was not. "We're not waiting the 30, I said. "Something's gone bad up top, and it's coming down that shaft one way or another. Water first, and God knows what after. The shaft's a trap now. We go to the sinkhole. We walk out the escape way." Nobody argued. Not even Boone, who argued with everything. And in that silence, in that quick, unanimous agreement, I should have read how scared they all were. Because scared men don't argue with a way out. But there was one man in that group whose silence meant something different from all the others, and I didn't catch it. In the back of the group, Garrett Sable was already looking down the mouth of the tunnel that led toward the escape way. Already turned toward it. Already, I understand now. Thinking about it in a way none of the rest of us were. And I looked at the set of his shoulders and the tilt of his head, and I read it as fear. The same fear I saw in all of them. Wasn't fear. It was a man checking a plan he'd made a long time ago against the way the night was actually unfolding. Getting to the sinkhole escapeway wasn't a matter of walking out a door. It was almost 2 miles of tunnel, most of it through the worked-out sections of the mine. The old rooms where the coal had been pulled years back, and nobody went anymore, except on inspection. In those sections, the air moves slow and stale. The roof is the oldest in the mine, and the pillars have had the longest time to feel the patient press of the mountain and start, here and there, to give. We'd take the man trip as far as the rail ran, which was maybe 2/3 of the way, and then we'd walk the rest on foot, through tunnels too old and too settled to keep track in. We loaded back into the car. I did a head count out of pure habit, the way you count your children at a fair without deciding to, touching each man with my eyes and my light. 8. Good. All present. I gave the word, and Sim ran us out of the shaft station, away from that pouring warm poison, down into the dark, toward the old workings. We hadn't gone 400 feet down the rail when the radio in my hand crackled, and a voice came out of it. And it wasn't Cole Rennick. It was a woman, and she was screaming. Not words, just a raw, open scream that filled the little speaker and then broke off all at once. Cut clean, and in the silence after it, a man's voice came on. Close and flat and terribly calm, the calm of a man past the far edge of panic. "Don't come up," he said. "Whatever you do, don't come up. They're in the yard." Then static. Then nothing. I keyed the radio, my thumb pressing so hard the plastic creaked. "This is Voss, shift boss, Blackwater 4. Who is this? Say again. Who is this? Where are you?" Nothing came back to me. Just the hum of the man-trip motor and the rush of the rail under us, and 7 men who had gone very still and were all very carefully not looking at each other. "They," Rooster said finally. And it was a terrible thing to hear that big laughing voice come out so small. "Who's they, Earl?" Nobody answered him because nobody knew. And underground, the imagination is a worse enemy than almost anything real. I have seen strong men, good men, come apart down there over shadows and echoes, over a sound they couldn't name. The mind fills the dark with whatever it fears most, and once it starts, it doesn't stop. What we needed, right then, more than answers, was a task, something to put our hands and our thoughts on. So I gave them work. "Sim, I want the escapeway status the second we're off the car. Doors, air, water, all of it. Del, you've walked that route more than any man alive on this crew. You know every marker. You're our navigation. You're up front. Boone, you keep the crew tight. Nobody strings out. Nobody wanders. Trace, you stay on Del's shoulder like his shadow and you don't drift. You hear me, not 1 foot. Rooster, you're on Boone." I turned my head to the back of the car. "Garrett, you know where all the caches are. You're always in them. I want you doing inventory in your head as we go. Food, water, first aid, and every self-rescuer in this section. When we stop, I want to know exactly what we've got to work with." "On it, Earl," Garrett said. "Easy as Sunday morning. I've got the whole layout." And that, right there, in the dark, with a woman's scream still ringing in all our ears, was the worst mistake I've ever made in my life. I had just handed the one man who was going to betray us the perfect, official, boss-sanctioned reason to know exactly where every last piece of emergency equipment in that section of the mine was kept, and to be the one who told the rest of us what was there. I gave him the keys to the thing that would kill us, and he took them. And he said thank you with my crew member's name in his mouth. Del Pretty took us through the old workings from memory once the rail ran out. And I will tell you that watching Del work was the one thing that steadied me the whole night through. The man was 59 years old and thin as a whip. And he read that mind like a preacher reads scripture, like the words were already inside him, and he was just letting them out. At every intersection, he'd stop, tilt his head, close his eyes for half a second, and feel the air move across his face. Air is the mind's blood, and air tells you which way is out if you know how to ask it. He'd check the reflective markers we'd hung on the ribs years back, little squares of tape that threw our lights back white, hung for exactly this, for men walking out in an emergency. And then he'd point. Left, straight on, left again. No hesitation, no doubling back. The rail petered out just where he'd said it would, and we climbed down off the man-trip into standing water that came to our ankles. Cold now, the clean, honest cold of groundwater, without the chemical warmth of the shaft. And it was almost a comfort after that pouring poison. We walked. 8 lights in a ragged line strung out through tunnels where no man had worked in a decade. The pillars in the old workings were bigger and older, and some of them had begun to fail at the edges the way old pillars do. The coal sloughing off in slabs and heaps at the base, a thing we call rib roll. And it's a killer. A slab the size of a door can come off a rib without a sound, and take your leg or your life. So you learn to walk down the middle of the tunnel, away from the ribs, in the belly of the passage, where the roof is highest and the rock is furthest away. The roof in some of those old rooms had come down low over the years, low enough that Rooster had to fold himself nearly double to pass, cursing quietly with every step. And it dripped, always dripping. And the drips echoed. And the dark pressed in from every side the way it does when your headlamp is the only light that has ever existed in that place and ever will. That's when Trace stopped walking. The kid just froze mid-stride, and Dell, right behind him, nearly walked up his back. "Listen," Trace whispered. And there was something in the whisper that got all of us at once. We stopped. Every man killed his chatter and his shuffling, and went still. And under the endless dripping, under the far-off drone of the ventilation fan still turning somewhere up top, I heard it. Somewhere ahead of us, off in the direction of the escapeway, something was moving. It wasn't the mine settling. That patient popping and creaking I knew like my own heartbeat. It wasn't water. It was a wet, dragging, deliberate sound. Something being hauled across rock and through standing water, and then, riding under it, a second sound. One that reached into me and closed a cold fist around something at the base of my spine. A low, broken moan. Human, but wrong. The sound of a voice coming up out of a body that had forgotten how a voice was supposed to work. A sound with no words in it and no mind behind it. Only need. That came from the escapeway, Dell said very quietly. And the fact that Dell said it, Dell who never spooked, made it worse. That came from up ahead of us, from toward the sinkhole. And the radio in my hand, the radio that had gone dead, chose that exact moment to crackle one more time with the flat, calm man's voice from before, closer somehow, or clearer, saying only 2 words into the dark before it died for the last time. "They're inside." I need you to understand what those 2 words did to 8 men standing under a mile of solid rock. Up until that moment, whatever was wrong had been up top. In the world of daylight and open yards and hoist houses, a world we were fighting to climb back into. The horror had been overhead, on the surface, and the mine, for all its dark and its weight, had been the place we were trying to escape to. "They're inside," turned that inside out. It meant the thing had come down. It meant whatever had made steady Cole Rennick say quarantine and then go silent forever was in the mine. Now, in the dark with us, somewhere in the 2 miles between where our boots stood in the cold water and the only other door out of the mountain. Boone was the first to move, and he moved the way panic moves. Wrong. He grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. We go back to the shaft. We wait for the cage. "There's no cage coming, Boone. You know that." Then we wait until there is. We hunker down at the station, we lock the gate, we wait it out. With warm chemical water pouring down onto us out of a fire we can't see or fight. With the word quarantine coming down that shaft. I kept my voice flat and low and level. Because flat is contagious in exactly the way panic is. And a boss's calm is the only medicine there is for a crew's fear. The shaft's a trap now, Boone. It's a hole with something bad at the top of it. The sinkhole is a way out into open country. Yes, there's something between us and it. But out is where we're going. We're just going to be smart about how. And then I told them the truth, which is not always what a boss does. But it was the only currency I had left worth spending. I don't know what's ahead of us. I don't know what they means. That man's they. And I'm not going to stand here and make up a monster for you. Because whatever your mind builds in the dark is worse than whatever's really there. What I know is this mine. I know it better than anything alive down here knows it. Better than that thing up ahead knows it. Better than any man on the surface knows it. We move quiet. We move together. We don't string out. And we go a way that thing might not expect. Trust the mine. Trust me to read it. That's all I've got to give you, and it's a lot. Because there was another way to the sinkhole. Not the main escapeway, the one the wet dragging sound and the broken moaning were coming from, but a set of old crossed tunnels, the abandoned number 2 panel, sealed off years back with ventilation stoppings. Now, a stopping isn't a locked door, and I need you to see it clearly. A ventilation stopping is a wall, usually cinder block, that we build across a tunnel to control which way the air flows, to make the fresh air go where we need it and the used air go out where it should. Some of those block walls have a man door built into them, a little steel door on hinges that a man can open to pass through and then close behind him. So the wall does its job for the air, but still lets people move around. The number 2 panel had been walled off with those stoppings, but the man doors were still there, still usable. And the thing about number 2 was that it ran roughly parallel to the main escapeway, off to the side of it, and rejoined the main line about 600 feet before the Sinkhole portal itself. It was longer than the main way, and the air in it would be a problem. Dead, unmoving, sealed off from the ventilation for years, which is a danger all its own. But it wouldn't have whatever was in the escapeway making that sound. "Sim," I said, "the number 2 stoppings, the man doors, are they still passable? When'd you last see them?" Sim thought about it, and I watched him call up the last inspection in his head. "Should be passable. We checked them on rounds. Last I laid eyes on, yeah, doors were sound, hinges free." Then his face changed. "But Earl, the air in that panel, it hasn't seen ventilation in years. Sealed up like that? Could be black damp built up in the low spots. Low oxygen, high carbon dioxide. Could be a pocket of methane for all we know. We walk into that panel without breathing gear, and we could all just get lightheaded, and then peaceful, and then sit down to rest, and then never get back up. Black damp doesn't hurt. That's what makes it a killer. It just puts you to sleep." "That's what the self-rescuers are for," I said. "That's exactly what they're for. Garrett, the caches, tell me what we've got." And here it is. Here is the moment. I'm going to slow it all the way down for you, because you need to see it the way I couldn't, standing there in the cold water with a monster ahead and a monster overhead, and no idea at all that the worst monster of the night was standing quietly at the back of my own crew. A self-rescuer is a small breathing device. Every miner wears one on his belt, and every emergency cache holds more of them. And they are the single most important piece of survival equipment underground. The ones on our belts were the small kind, the SCSR units. Good for maybe an hour of hard breathing if you kept your head and didn't run. But to walk the better part of a mile through a sealed, unventilated panel full of dead air, 1 hour apiece would not be enough. Not with the pace we could manage in low roof and standing water. For that, we'd need the big long-duration units, the ones stored in the emergency caches, an hour or better each, meant exactly for a long walk through bad air. And there was a cache right at the mouth of number 2 panel. It was supposed to hold a full set and then some. Enough for a crew and spares. Garrett Sable looked at me, and his light was pointed down at the black water swirling around his boots, not at my face. And he said, "Number 2 cache is full. I checked it 3 days ago on my rounds. Big units, the long-duration ones, 12 of them, minimum, all seated and sealed. We're good, Earl. We can make the walk." And I felt my whole chest come unlocked. I felt the first real hope of the entire night flood into me, warm as that poisoned water and 1,000 times more welcome. We had a way. A hard way, a long way, through bad air, but a way. And it went around the thing in the escapeway. And Garrett had just told me the door to it was standing wide open. "Then that's the route," I said. "Del, take us to the number 2 portal. We suit up in the long-duration units at the stopping, and we walk ourselves out through the dead panel, nice and steady. Number 2 rejoins the escapeway right near the sinkhole, past whatever's up ahead. We go around it. We turned. We put our backs to the wet dragging sound and its broken moaning, and we walked the other way, toward number 2. And every single man in that line believed we had found our way out. Because Garrett Sable had looked at me and told me the cache was full. And there was no reason under heaven for a man to lie to his own crew about a thing like that. No reason on earth. And I would have staked my life on there being no reason. I did stake my life on it. I staked 7 other men's lives on it too. If you've ever had to put your life in the hands of a stranger, underground or anywhere, a man you'd known only a few months and decided to trust, I'd honestly like to hear about it down in the comments. Because what happened next is the reason I don't trust the same way I used to. It's the reason I look twice at pleasant men now. The entrance to number 2 panel was a cinder block stopping with a steel man door set into the middle of it, painted safety yellow. Though the paint had faded to the color of old bone and was streaked all over with the black grime that gets into every surface underground. Bolted to the coal rib right beside the door was the cache. A steel box, painted that same faded yellow, about the size of a big chest freezer, with a heavy hinged lid and a simple lever latch on the front. I'd opened that box on inspection a dozen times over the years. I knew the sound its latch made. Dell got there first with Trace glued to his shoulder just like I'd told him. Boone and I came up next, water sheeting off our legs. Sim and Rooster and Hollis and Garrett brought up the rear in a loose knot. And I actually remember, thinking that we'd done it. That the hard part was the deciding. And we decided right, and now all that stood between us and the surface was the simple work of gearing up and putting one boot in front of the other through a mile of bad air. I remember letting myself picture the rain on my face at the top of the sinkhole slope. Trace opened the cache. I heard the lever latch clack up, the exact sound I knew. And I heard the heavy lid come up on its stiff, protesting hinges. And then I heard the kid make a sound I didn't understand at first. It wasn't a scream. It was much smaller and much worse than a scream. A little confused exhale, a soft grunt of pure incomprehension. The sound a man makes when the world in front of his eyes stops matching the world inside his head and his brain can't yet make them meet. "Earl," he said. His voice had gone strange and thin. "Earl, it's empty." I pushed past Dell, put my hand on the cold lip of the box, and shone my light down into it. It was empty. Not nearly empty. Not short a few units. Empty. Where a dozen long-duration self-rescuers should have been sitting nested in their gray foam cradles, there were 12 empty cradles, each one molded to hold the exact shape of the thing that was no longer in it. 12 perfect absences. The units were gone, every one, and they had not been gone long. Because down in one corner of the box lay a coil of the thin plastic banding they shipped the units strapped in. And that banding was still soft and clean and curled, not yet gone stiff and gray with the dust that coats everything down there within days. Somebody had opened that box, cut those units free of their bands, and carried them all away. Recently, on purpose. With time to do it neat, I stood there with my light pooling in that empty steel box, and I felt the mine tilt under my boots. And it wasn't the mountain moving. It was the understanding arriving all at once. The whole ugly shape of it, dropping into place like the last block of a stopping being seated into a wall. Somebody had emptied an emergency cache of every breathing unit in it. And there were only a handful of people in the whole world who would have known those units were there, who would have known how to find this box in the dark, who would have had the time and the reason to do it. And I had, just an hour before, personally put one of them in charge of the caches. I turned around. Slow, my light coming up off the water and up the line of my crew. "Garrett," I said, and my own voice sounded like it belonged to somebody else. "You told me this cache was full. 3 days ago. You said 12 units, seated and sealed." Garrett Sable was standing at the back of the group, apart from the rest, and his light was no longer pointed down at the water. It was pointed off to the side, at the black mouth of the main escapeway, the way we'd all agreed not to go. And on his face, in the scatter of our lights, was an expression I had never once seen there, in 4 months of working beside the man. It wasn't fear. It was concentration. It was arithmetic. He was doing math, fast, and I could see the exact moment he understood that the answer no longer added up the way he'd planned. And I could see that I was not anywhere in that answer. That none of us were. "I did check it," he said. And even his voice was different now. Flatter, the warm, easy sand all gone out of it. Like a man setting down a costume he'd worn so long it had started to feel like skin. It was full 3 days ago. That was true. I emptied it 2 days ago. For a long second, nobody said anything. The words came out of him and hung there in the dark, and would not fit into any room in my head. "You did what?" Boone said. "I moved them," Garrett said. "The units, all 12. I moved them to where I needed them to be." "Where you needed them," I repeated. My mouth was dry. "I've got a way out," Garrett said. "A good one, a quiet one. And it's got exactly enough air staged along it for exactly the number of people it'll carry. I did the numbers a month ago, more than a month. Ran it 12 ways." He looked at me then, straight at me. And the terrible thing, the thing I still can't get out from under, is that there was something almost like apology in his eyes. "It doesn't carry 8, Earl. It never carried 8. He let out a breath. "I'm sorry, I really am. But you all went and did the one thing I was praying you wouldn't do. You figured out the number 2 panel, and now you know the air's dead in there. And now you're going to want to come with me, and you can't. There isn't room, and there isn't air. And I'm not going to die, so that you can find that out the slow way. I have thought about that moment more than I have thought about anything else in my entire life. More than my wedding, more than the births of my children. And I still cannot tell you the exact instant the fear in me turned into something colder and harder than fear. Maybe it was when I understood that Garrett Sable had not come to Blackwater 4 months ago to mine coal. Maybe it was when I understood that a man who volunteers for the coffee run, who memorizes escapeways, who counts caches and knows to the ounce how much fuel is in the man trip, is not being friendly and is not being helpful. He is being thorough. He is mapping. He had been mapping our mine, our supplies, our exits, our habits, our weaknesses, for 4 solid months, patient as the mountain. And I had handed him the last piece of the map myself, an hour ago, in the dark, when I put him in charge of the caches and thanked him for it. "What's up top, Garrett?" I said. "You knew. Before the phone ever went dead, you knew what was coming down that shaft, didn't you?" He didn't deny it. That is the piece I keep circling back to, even now. He didn't even bother to try. "I knew it was possible," he said. "I knew what to watch for. Where I worked before, out west, we ran drills for this exact thing. Not fires, not floods, not roof falls. This. Something that gets into people and turns them, fast. And the only things that have ever worked against it are distance and a sealed door. Nothing else. Not fighting it, not talking to it, not waiting it out with it in the room. Distance and a door. When Cole started the quarantine sequence up top, when I heard that word, I knew we had maybe an hour, maybe a little more, before whatever's up there found the shaft and came down looking. He shook his head slowly, and he almost looked tired. You can't beat it in a group, Earl. That's the thing you don't understand, and I do. Groups are loud. Groups are slow. Groups make choices they can't take back for each other. They stop for the wounded. They argue at the doors. The only way through a thing like this is small and quiet and selfish. And I made my peace with being that a long, long time before tonight. How many? Dell said. His old voice was very quiet, very steady, and somehow it cut clean through everything. 12 units. How many men does your way out carry, Garrett? How many were you ever planning to bring? Garrett looked at the old man, and for the first time, something crossed his face that might, in another man, have been shame. 1, he said. I'm taking 1. Me. The other 11 units aren't spares for other people. They're staging, along the route. You breathe through a dead panel that long. You cache fresh units ahead of yourself, so you never run dry. You swap out before the first one gives up. 11 units, spaced right, gets 1 man through a mile of dead air with margin left over. It does not get 8 men through with nothing on their belts but the little hour units. It gets 1 man out. It was only ever going to get 1 man out. And then he did the thing that turned all the blood in my body to ice water standing still in my veins. He reached back behind his hip, to the tool belt at the small of his back, under his jacket where I hadn't seen it. And he brought out our radio. Not his, ours. The crew radio, the one thing that might reach a rescue party on the surface. The one thing that had already carried 2 warnings to us out of the dark. He must have lifted it off the man trip. He must have lifted it an hour ago, back at the shaft station, back when I'd put him in the rear seat right next to the emergency locker and thought nothing at all of it. He'd had it on him the whole time, this whole time, while I was making my plans and giving him jobs. I need this, he said, and he said it almost gently. There are people I'm supposed to meet. At the Sinkhole portal, up top on the surface, with a vehicle. It's timed. There's a window. If I can't signal them when I reach the top, they leave without me. And then I'm as dead as... He caught himself. As us, I finished for him. I was going to say as anybody who gets left down here, he said. But we both knew exactly what he'd been about to say. And so did every man standing in that water. Here is what that radio meant. And I need you to hold it the way I held it, standing there, because it is the clock that ran under everything that came after. The Sinkhole portal, our one remaining way out, came up on a hillside almost 2 miles from the main entrance, out in country. On the surface around that portal head there was a security perimeter, a fenced yard, and it was tied into the very same quarantine system that Cole Rennick had triggered when whatever came for him came for him. When a quarantine goes hot, that perimeter seals, automatically, on a timer. It's designed to keep whatever is in the mine from getting out into the world. Garrett knew that timer. Garrett had studied that timer for a month. We didn't know it. And Garrett had just told us, without meaning to, that the perimeter at the top of our only exit was going to lock itself against us, and that the only way to signal the people on the outside who might hold it open, or who might be waiting past it, was the radio he was holding in his hand. How long? I said. The perimeter at the Sinkhole. How long until it seals for good? Garrett hesitated, and I watched him weigh it, watched him decide whether the lie or the truth would hurt us more, watched him land on the truth precisely because it was crueler. From the moment Cole started the sequence, he said, 90 minutes, and that was about 70 minutes ago. 20 minutes. We had 20 minutes to get 8 men either a mile through poison dead air with no breathing gear, which was death, or nearly 2 miles through the main escapeway past whatever was making that wet, dragging moan, which might also be death, and to reach a gate that was going to lock itself shut against us either way unless somebody had a working radio to signal the surface and hold it open. And Garrett Sable was about to walk away into the dead panel with all the air and the only radio. Both. He took a step backward, toward the mouth of the main escapeway, toward his staged units and his timed ride and his people with a vehicle. And Boone lunged for him. And I want to be exact about this, because it matters for what kind of men we were and what kind of man he was. Boone did not lunge to hurt him. Boone lunged for the radio, for the one thing that meant the rest of us might live. Garrett swung the heavy steel radio like a club and caught Boone across the temple, not hard enough to kill him, hard enough to drop him to one knee in the black water with the breath knocked out of him. And by the time Rooster and I got moving, Garrett was already through the man door into number 2 panel, into the sealed dead air. And he'd pulled the steel door shut behind him. We heard the latch throw home. And then we heard, muffled through the cinder block wall, the small, ordinary domestic sound of a man fitting a self-rescuer over his own face, calm as a fellow settling in for a bus ride, and then his boots moving away, unhurried, into a mile of air that would have put the rest of us to sleep forever inside of 10 minutes. I stood in the cold water with my hand on Boone's shaking shoulder and my light on that faded yellow door. And I understood, fully, finally, that the man who used to make our coffee had just sentenced 7 of us to die in the dark, and that he had done it without once raising his voice, and that he had apologized to us while he did it, and meant the apology, which was somehow the worst thing of all. If you'd been standing there, boots in that black water, empty box behind you and that locked door in front of you and 20 invisible minutes bleeding off a clock you couldn't see, what would you have done? I would honestly like to know, because I have never once been sure that what I did next was right. I've just been sure it was the only thing I could think of that wasn't giving up. Here's what I did. I turned my back on the door. I turned my back on Garrett Sable and his stolen air and his timed ride and his 11 staged units, because a man who is already gone is a waste of the only thing we had left in the world, which was time. Standing there, being angry at a locked door, would kill us just as dead as the black damp. I hauled Boone up out of the water by the back of his jacket. The gash Garrett had opened on his temple was bleeding the way head wounds always do. Ugly and free and looking worse than it was, running down into his eyebrow and off his jaw. But his eyes were tracking my light, moving when I moved it, and I knew he'd hold. Boone Hatley had taken worse than a radio to the head and gone back to arguing inside the hour. "Listen to me," I said, and I pitched it so all of them could hang on it. Boone still swaying, Dell, Trace white as the belly of a fish, Sim, Rooster, Hollis, all of them. The number 2 panel is dead to us. He's in it. The air's bad. We've got no long units, so forget it. Wipe it out of your heads. That door is finished for us. That leaves the main escapeway, the way with the noise. The way with them, Trace whispered, and I could hear his teeth wanting to chatter and him fighting to hold them still. The way with them, I agreed, because lying to that kid now would only get him killed slower, and he deserved better than a comfortable lie. But here's what I know that Garrett Sable, for all his maps and his month of numbers and his careful little plan, does not know. He's been in this mine 4 months. I've been in it 29 years. And there's a thing about the main escapeway he never had to learn, because he was never once planning to use it. He was always going out through number 2, so he never learned the escapeway the way I know it. I went down on one knee, right there in the water, and with my finger I drew in the coal mud on a dry ledge of rib. A little map, rough. The main escapeway a straight scratch, the branches coming off it, and my crew crouched down around me with their lights all pooled on my hand. And for just a moment, we weren't 7 terrified men waiting to die. We were miners, planning a route the way we'd done 10,000 times over 10,000 shifts, and there was comfort in the old motion of it. The main escapeway to the sinkhole runs more or less straight, I said. About 1.5 miles of it. That's where the sound is. That's where they are. But about 1/3 of the way along it, off to the side, there's the old pump station. The dewatering pump for the low side of the mine sits in its own room off the main line. And that room has a real door on it. Not a man door in a block wall, a real steel fire-rated door, and it locks from the inside. I looked up, moving my light across their faces one at a time. We can't outrun whatever's in that escapeway. We heard it, it's slow. But slow doesn't matter if it's already between us and out. But we don't have to run the whole 1.5 miles past it. We have to run 1/3 of a mile. Get to that pump station, get inside, throw the bolt, and use what's in there. What's in there? Sim asked, and he asked it low. And I could tell from his voice that Sim already half knew, because Sim knew the mine's guts better than anyone but Dell. A phone, I said. A hardwired phone on its own line, put in 20-some years ago, back when a pump man might work the low side alone, all shift, and need a way to call for help if he got hurt or trapped. It doesn't run through the main mine system. It runs up its own borehole, straight up through the rock to the old pump house on the hillside. And the pump house sits right beside the sinkhole, right next to the portal, right next to the perimeter. I watched the understanding move through them, one man at a time, like current finding its way through a circuit. You want to call the surface, Dell said slowly. On a line Garrett doesn't even know exists. I want to raise whoever's up there and beg them to hold that perimeter open long enough for us to reach it. Garrett's got the radio, fine, let him have it. Let him think he's the only voice that can reach the top. But if I can raise that pump house phone, maybe I get somebody on the surface, anybody, who can override that gate and hold it. And even if I can't, I stopped. Because this was the part that mattered most. The part that made the whole gamble worth making, even if the phone was as dead as everything else. Even if that phone's dead too, that pump station still gives us a steel door we can lock behind us. And a mine with a locked steel door between you and the thing hunting you is a mine you can survive in for a good while. Long enough to think straight, long enough to find another card to play. Right now, we've got no card at all. That door is a card. Nobody told me it was a good plan, because it wasn't a good plan. It was a desperate plan, built out of an old phone and an old door, and 29 years of knowing where things were. But a bad plan you can move your feet toward beats a good plan that doesn't exist, every single time. And I watched 7 frightened men decide, one by one, to move their feet. We moved. I put Dell up front again, because he was our eyes and our memory both. And I put Rooster right behind him, because Rooster was the biggest and the strongest. And if something came out of the dark, I wanted it to meet Rooster first. God forgive me for the cold arithmetic of that. But a boss does arithmetic like that in the dark, whether he wants to or not. And pretending otherwise is a lie. Trace in the middle, hemmed in on both sides. Sim and Hollis flanking Boone, who was walking now but slow, one hand pressed to his temple. And me at the rear, because the rear is where the boss belongs when the danger is ahead of the crew. And because some cold, quiet part of me was still listening back over my shoulder for that faded yellow door to open again. We went into the main escapeway, into the direction of the sound. And I felt every one of my 29 years in my knees as I did it. I have walked that escapeway more than 100 times on my monthly inspection, in the ordinary light of my own headlamp, with nothing in the world to fear but a loose bolt or a wet floor. I want to tell you it was a completely different place that night. And I mean that not as a figure of speech, but as a fact. The air moved wrong. On a normal night, the ventilation pushes steady down the escapeway. Clean intake air flowing toward the sinkhole. A breeze you can feel on the back of your neck, the mine breathing out. That night the air was slack, stagnant, barely moving at all. And what little it carried was a smell I had never smelled underground in 3 decades. A hot copper and spoiled meat smell. Thick, that got stronger with every dozen steps we took. Something up ahead had changed the airflow. Something was blocking the escapeway, or the fans up top were failing one by one. And either way, it meant the mine's own lungs were shutting down around us. And a mine that stops breathing is a mine that means to keep you. We hadn't gone 200 feet down that escapeway when Dell's light steadied on something at the low edge of the tunnel and stopped. And we found the first one. It was lying half in the water, half against the rib, a heap in the dark. And for a moment my mind did what a mind does, and told me it was a fallen coat, a spill of gear, an abandoned jacket. Then Dell's beam held on it, and I saw the boots, and the coveralls, and the belt with its lamp battery, and the hard hat still on the head. And I read the brass number tag riveted to the front of that hard hat, and knew it. It was a man from the shift before ours, the day shift going off as we came on. A fellow named Wick Tolliver that I had nodded to on the surface not 4 hours earlier. A quiet man with grown daughters he was always fixing to visit. He was not moving. And then he was. I'm going to be careful about how I tell you this, because the truth of it is bad enough that it doesn't need dressing up, and because there are things it does no good to say out loud. Wick Tolliver's body turned toward our lights, and it moved wrong, jerking and boneless and stiff all at the same time, like a puppet with half its strings cut and the other half being yanked by somebody who'd never worked a puppet before. It made that low, broken moan we'd been hearing come toward us through the tunnels, up close now, a sound that came out of Wick's chest, with no breath control and no words, and no man behind it. His eyes came around into our light and threw it back flat and empty, the way an animal's eyes throw back light at night. A flat, wet shine with nothing reading the world behind it. Nothing but a wanting that had no thought in it. Whatever had gotten into the men on the surface had gotten into Wick Tolliver. And Wick was 600 feet underground with the rest of us. And Wick was not Wick anymore. He started to drag himself toward us through the water, one arm pulling, the legs not working right. Trace screamed. I don't blame the kid one bit. I very nearly screamed myself, and I'd been underground longer than Trace Odom had been alive. Back, Dell said, and he was backing up already, slow, steady, his old voice somehow the calmest thing in that whole tunnel of pounding hearts. Slow, everybody slow. Look at it. Look, it's hurt. It can't hardly move. It's slow. We go slow and we go around it. Do not run. You run in here, you'll brain yourself on the roof or roll your ankle in the sump, and then you're worse off than him. Slow, around. And Dell was right. And that steadiness of his kept us alive in that first bad minute, the way a good deckhand keeps a boat off the rocks. The turned ones were not fast. That is the thing the movies lie about, and the thing that actually saved us more than once that night. Whatever this sickness was, it burned a body up quick and left it broken behind. And Wick Tolliver could not stand, and could barely crawl, and could not have caught a walking child. The danger was never one of them, one slow, broken man in the water. The danger was two things. It was that where there was one, there would be more. And it was panic, our own panic, which in a low, wet tunnel full of rock and machinery will kill you a dozen ways before anything with a mouth ever reaches you. So we went around Wick Tolliver. We pressed ourselves to the high rib, watching the roof, watching the water, and we filed around him one at a time in the dark. And he turned his ruined head to track our lights, and reached one hand out into the water toward us and could do nothing more than that, his fingers opening and closing on nothing. I made myself look at him as I passed, because he had been a man I knew. And it seemed to me somebody ought to look at him, and know him even now. I will hear that low moan and the small splash of that reaching, grasping hand until the last day of my own life. And then, past him, our lights found the others. Not a crowd, not a swarm boiling out of the dark. That's the movies again. And the truth was worse in its own quiet way, because it was smaller and it was people. 4 of them, spread out down the escapeway over the next 50 or 60 yards, all of them in the coveralls and boots and hard hats of the day shift. All of them turned, all of them slow and broken and dragging themselves through the standing water, and all of them beginning, in their ruined, patient way, to turn toward our lights and our sound, and come. I understood, looking at them scattered down that tunnel. What must have happened? And understanding it was its own small horror. They'd come down the shaft when the surface went hot, when the quarantine failed and whatever it was got loose up top. The shift before us, some of them maybe already sick, already turning, had done the exact thing that 30 years of training and instinct tells a miner to do in an emergency. They'd gone for the escapeway. They'd tried to walk themselves out the sinkhole. And somewhere in that 1.5 miles, in the dark, the sick ones had turned all the way, and turned on the others. And now they filled the one clean route we had, slow and patient, and thick enough to block the way to the pump station door. "We can't go through that," Hollis said. He'd been quiet the whole night, the loner from Boone County, watching everything, saying almost nothing. And now he spoke, and there was iron under the quiet. 4 of them across 50 yards of low tunnel, standing water, and Boone hurt and slow. All it takes is one of them gets a hand on a sleeve, one grip, and you're not getting loose in time, not in this footing. We go into that, and we lose somebody, sure. We can't. He was right. And the clock Garrett had wound was still bleeding down behind my eyes. 15 minutes now, maybe less, until the sinkhole perimeter locked itself for good. We were only a third of the way to the pump station, and 4 turned men stood between us and it in a tunnel 1 man wide, and Hollis Pruitt was dead right that we could not simply walk through them. I stood there in that stinking, slack, dead air, with my crew's lights all swinging back to me again, all of them waiting for me to know a thing. And for one long, terrible stretch of seconds, I did not know a thing. I had bet everything on the pump station, on an old phone and a lockable door. And between me and that bet stood 4 men I had known and traded nods with, turned now into slow, patient death. And there was no way around them. Because a tunnel is a tunnel, and it goes one direction, and it is only ever as wide as it is, except that it isn't, not in a real mine. And that, right there, is the 29 years talking again, the thing Garrett Sable's 4 months could never buy him. "The overcast," I said. Dell's head came up fast, and I heard hope pour back into his old voice like water flooding back into a dry pump housing. "The overcast," he said. "God almighty, Earl. The overcast. Let me tell you what an overcast is, because it's about to save our lives. And it's exactly the kind of thing that only a man who has spent his life underground would ever think to reach for. To keep fresh air and used air from mixing, a mine builds air bridges. The clean intake air runs down one tunnel, and the dirty return air runs down a tunnel that crosses it at a right angle. And where those two tunnels cross, you cannot simply let the air streams mix, because then your fresh air stops being fresh. So instead, you build a bridge, a sealed passage that carries one of the air streams up and over the top of the other, a tunnel over a tunnel. That's an overcast. And the old one along this stretch of the escapeway, the one I'd inspected 100 times and never once thought of as anything but a thing to check off a list, had a maintenance hatch. A steel ladder bolted to the rib, running up into the belly of the air bridge so a man could climb up into the crossing passage and work on it. Up into a crawl space above the main line, above the heads of the turned men, into a tight steel passage that 4 broken bodies, who could not stand and could barely crawl, would never in this world be able to climb. "There's a maintenance hatch about 40 feet ahead," I said, fast now, the whole shape of it coming clear. "High on the left rib, before the worst of them. I make it 2 of the turn to this side of the hatch, 2 of them past it. We go at the near 2, not to fight, God no, just to get past them, up the ladder, into the overcast, across the top, and down the far ladder past the rest of them. It's tight up in there. Boone's gonna have to climb hurt. But it puts a ceiling of steel and rock between us and every one of them." "And drops us where?" Sim asked. "About 200 feet from the pump station door," I said. "Clear of all of them." I looked at Boone. His face was gray under the streaks of dried blood, the whole side of his head dark with it. But his eyes were clear and hard and mean. And Boone Hatley at his meanest was worth 2 ordinary men. "Can you climb?" "I can climb," Boone said, and he wiped blood out of his eye with the back of his wrist. "You get me to the ladder, I'll climb. Worry about your own self." We did it fast because slow would kill us, as surely as running would. We went at the near 2 turned men in a tight, hard knot, all our lights up and full in their flat, empty eyes to blind and confuse them. And we did not fight them. We flowed around them the way a creek flows around a stone in its bed. And Rooster, God love that enormous man forever, dropped his shoulder and drove the nearer one hard, sent it sprawling and splashing down into the sump. And that bought us 3 whole seconds, and 3 seconds was exactly and only what we needed to reach the ladder. Dell went up first, quick as a much younger man, then Trace right on his heels scrambling, then Sim, reaching down to haul Boone up rung by the collar, while Hollis put both hands under Boone's boots and pushed from below. Rooster next, folding his big frame into the hatch. Then me, last, the boss last, and below me in the water, the turned men gathered underneath the hatch and reached up with their broken arms toward the light and the warmth of us, and moaned, and could not do the one thing they needed to do, could not climb, could not do anything at all, but stand ruined in the dark below the bridge and want us. And we crawled across the top of that overcast, over their heads, single file on our hands and knees in a low steel box of a passage. And cool, clean intake air was moving through it, moving across our faces for the first time all night. And I swear to you, it felt like the breath of the whole living world, reaching down into the earth to find us and tell us we weren't dead yet. We came down the far ladder, about 200 feet from the pump station, and the escapeway ahead of us was empty, blessedly empty, and we ran. The pump station door was steel, fire-rated, painted the safety yellow that means shelter here, survive here, and it was standing open the way it always stood open, hooked back against the rib. We poured through it out of the tunnel, and I put my whole weight and all 51 years of me against that door. And I swung it shut, and I threw the interior bolt home. And the heavy, solid sound of that bolt seeding into its keeper was, without any exaggeration at all, the finest sound I have heard in my entire life. Better than my children crying their first cries. I'm sorry, but it's true. And that night makes its own truth. For a moment, we just stood in that little room in the dark of our own lamps and breathed. The pump station was maybe 20 feet on a side, hollowed out of solid rock, and it held the big dewatering pump and its electric motor. Silent now, squatting in the middle of the floor, and a heavy workbench along one wall, and a rack of tools, wrenches and pry bars and a big pipe wrench, and a shelf of pump parts and gaskets furred with years of dust. And there, mounted on the far wall on its own length of conduit that ran up into the rock of the roof, was the phone. The old pump station phone. Beige plastic on the color of weak coffee. Filthy, 20-some years old, hardwired, running up its own borehole through 600 feet of rock to the pump house on the hillside beside the sinkhole. Beside the sinkhole. Where Garrett Sable was, right at that moment, breathing our stolen air, walking calm and steady through the dead panel toward a timed ride and a perimeter that was about to seal. Thinking himself the only living soul in that mountain with a way to reach the top. I want to stop here for a breath, because this little rock room is where the night turned, where it stopped being only a chase through the dark and became a reckoning. We were safe for the moment behind that steel door. The turned men could not work a bolt, could not turn a knob, could barely lift an arm. We had air, clean intake air flowing gently through the station from the ventilation. We had, by my count now, maybe 10 minutes before the sinkhole perimeter sealed forever. And we had a filthy old phone that might reach the surface, or might be as dead as everything else in that mountain. And one way or the other, the next 10 minutes, we're going to decide whether 7 men walked back into daylight or died together in a locked room under a ridge in Logan County. I crossed the room and I picked up the phone. My hand, I noticed, was not steady. There was a dial tone. I have never in all my days been so purely glad to hear a stupid, ordinary, buzzing dial tone. It meant the borehole line was intact through all that rock. It meant the pump house up on the hillside still had power feeding it. It meant there was one unbroken copper wire running between me and the surface of the earth that Garrett Sable did not know existed and had never planned for. My hands were shaking now, both of them. The adrenaline of the overcast and the run all crashing down at once. And I made myself steady enough to dial the only number that phone could reach. The pump house extension, worn into the plastic buttons by 20 years of thumbs. It rang. It rang again. And I stood there, counting the rings like they were the last heartbeats of somebody I loved more than my own life. Somebody picked up. Pump house. A man's voice. Tight, high, scared, but alive. A living human voice on the surface of the world. "This is Earl Voss," I said, and it all came out of me in a rush I couldn't stop. "Shift boss, night crew, Blackwater 4. I'm at the bottom of the sinkhole line in the low side pump station. I've got 7 men alive with me down here, and we are coming out the sinkhole portal. Do you copy me? Do you hear me? We are alive, and we are coming out." There was a silence on that line that went on a beat too long. And in that silence, I felt the whole thing start to go wrong before he ever said a word. "Voss." The voice on the other end had changed. Gone careful. The kind of careful you get with a man when you're about to hurt him and you don't want to. "Earl? My name's Ansel Carraway. I'm a deputy, county emergency response. I'm at the pump house because it's outside the hot zone. It's the far edge of it. Earl, I need you to listen to me now. Real careful, because I've only got time to say this once. The sinkhole portal perimeter is on an automatic quarantine seal. It went hot about 90 minutes ago when the sequence started at the main site. And it is going to lock. Hard lock, physical steel bolts, not a gate you can push in. I heard him check something, heard papers or a screen, heard the pure terror come up in his voice as he read it in about 8 minutes. And once it hard locks, Earl, I can't open it. Nobody can open it from out here. It's built that way on purpose. It's built to keep whatever's in that mine inside that mine, and it does not care who's on the wrong side of it when it goes. Then override it, I said. My voice cracked on it. You're standing right there. You said you're right there at the pump house. Override it. Hold it open. We're coming. We can make it. It's 600 feet up the escapeway to where number 2 rejoins, and then the slope to the portal. We can run that. We can make it. There's an override, Carraway said, and I could hear him wanting it to be simpler than it was. There is. But Earl, listen, the override's not out here where I am. It's on the inside. It's a manual release, mounted at the portal head, inside the fence, inside the perimeter. Somebody has to be standing right there at the portal, on the inside of the seal, holding that release, for the gate to stay open. From out here, all I can do is stand at the fence and watch it lock. I'm sorry. From out here, there's nothing. It has to be held from the inside. And that was when the last piece dropped into place. The worst piece. The piece Garrett Sable had understood a full month before, sitting somewhere with his numbers, working the cold arithmetic that I was only now being forced to work myself. The sinkhole gate needed a man on the inside to hold it open. One man at the portal head, holding a release lever down with his own body while the others went through. And that man could not then go through himself, because the instant he let go of the release, the gate would begin its final seal. And a man cannot outrun a steel bolt that is already thrown. One man had to stay inside the mountain, holding the door, so that the others could pass through it into the world. Garrett wasn't just walking out first to beat us to a ride. Garrett was walking out through a gate that somebody had to stay behind and hold. His timed ride, his people with a vehicle, they weren't there to hold the gate open from outside, because it couldn't be held from outside, and he'd have known that for a month. They were there because Garrett had figured out that if he reached the portal first, alone, ahead of everyone, he could slip through the seal in the last minutes before it locked. And then it would lock behind him, with every other living soul still trapped inside, and he would never have to stay behind and hold anything open for anyone, ever. He wasn't stealing an exit from us. He was stealing the last handful of minutes before the exit sealed itself shut, and leaving the ceiling to do his killing for him. So his hands stayed clean. "Deputy," I said, very slowly. And something cold and clear was building in me now, under all the fear, a plan, a terrible one. "Carraway? Is there a man at the portal head right now? Inside the fence, on the inside of the seal?" "No," Carraway said. "Portal's empty. Nobody there. I can see the whole head from here. It's lit. There's nobody at it." "Why? Voss, why are you asking me that?" Because Garrett wasn't there yet. Because the number 2 panel was longer than the main escapeway, considerably longer. And Garrett had gambled everything on beating us to the portal on his stolen staged air. But he'd taken the long, safe way around to avoid the turned men in the escapeway. And we had gone up and over their heads through an overcast. He never in 4 months of mapping knew was there. And for the first time all night, the 29 years had bought us the one thing his 4 months could not. We were closer to the portal than Garrett Sable was. "Deputy Caraway," I said. "Stay on this line. Don't you hang up. We are coming out the sinkhole, and we are going to hold that gate open ourselves, from the inside." I hung up the phone. I turned around. 6 men in that little rock room, their lights all on me. Blood and water and coal dust all over every one of them. And I told them what I've just told you. All of it. The gate. The manual release at the portal head. The one man who has to stay behind, inside, and hold it. And Garrett, somewhere out there in the dead panel, racing us right now to a portal he still believed was going to be his alone. I said it all in about 30 seconds, because 30 seconds was very close to all we had. The room went quiet in a way I will never forget as long as I draw breath. Because every single man in it understood instantly, without another word needing to be said, the exact shape of the choice in front of us. 6 men could go through that gate and live. One man had to stay behind, on the inside, and hold it open for them, in a mind filling up with the turned dead, with no way out for himself after. 6 live. 1 stays. That was the whole of it, and it hung in that little room like the smell of the spoiled air. "I'll hold it," I said before anyone else could get a breath in. "It's my crew. It's my mine. It's my call, and it's my job. I'll stay and hold the gate." "The hell you will," Boone said, and he stepped up, swaying a little, the blood black down the side of his face. "You're the only one who knows how to get this crew the rest of the way out and up that slope in the dark. You go through, you get them home, and you tell every living soul what he did, what Garrett did. Somebody's got to carry that out of here, and it has to be you. They'll believe you." He touched the wound on his temple, almost gently. "And I'm hurt, Earl. I'm slow, I'm dizzy. I've been fighting it this whole time. I'd never make the run to the gate anyway. I'd just get somebody killed dragging me. I'll hold the gate. It makes sense, and you know it makes sense." "Boone." "Earl." And then Del Pretty stepped forward. The old man, 59 years old, with his dead wife laminated in the crown of his hard hat, thin as a fence rail. And he put one flat hand on the center of my chest, not pushing, just resting it there. And his voice was the calmest and most certain thing in that entire mountain. "Stop, both of you. Stop it now. You've got children, Boone. You've got a wife home right now who's going to want to tear this man Garrett apart with her own 2 hands when she hears. And she's going to need you there to hold her back and be held. That's your job tonight, going home, not this." He smiled at me then, and it was a terrible, gentle, peaceful thing, that smile. "I've got a photograph and a pension I was never all that sure I'd live to collect. I've been down in this dark 40 years, Earl. 40. I always figured somewhere in the back of my mind I'd die down here. Most of us old ones do one way or another. So let me pick the day. Let me pick the reason. There's not a better one than this coming, and I'm not going to get another chance to choose." Nobody said anything to that, because there was nothing anybody could say that would be true. And Del Pretty had never in 40 years had any patience for words that weren't true. There's a question I've turned over every single night since that night, lying awake, and I'm going to put it to you the plain way it was put to me, because all these years later, I still do not have the answer to it. When the way out only fits some of you, and one man has to stay behind and die so that the rest can live, who gets to decide which one? The man who volunteers? The man with the least left to lose? The boss, whose crew it is? I made a choice in that room, in the dark, in about half a minute, and I have never once been certain it was mine to make or that I made it right. So tell me, Tell me what you would have done, standing there. We didn't have time to argue it out, and Dell didn't give us the chance to. He was already moving toward the door, while Boone was still forming his next objection, already reaching for the bolt to throw it back. And the plain truth is that he was right, and every man in that room knew he was right. And that is the part that still sits on my chest at 3 a.m, like a fallen slab of the mountain roof. The arithmetic of that little rock room only had one clean answer in it, and Del Pretty had worked it faster than the rest of us because he had done it out of love. And love does its math quick. I won't call what he did anything smaller than that. It was love. I've had years to find a smaller word for it, and there isn't one. We went out of that pump station in a hard, flat run. Del in the lead because even now, even doing what he was about to do, he still knew the way better than any of us. 600 feet of escape way to where number 2 rejoined the line, and then the sinkhole slope, and then up. We ran it flat out, boots hammering the wet rock and throwing up sheets of black water, our lights jerking crazy across the ribs and roof. Boone gasping and falling off the pace, and Rooster looping back without a word to get an arm under him and half carry him along. And the whole time, the clock Deputy Carraway had read off to me counted down in the back of my skull. 8 minutes. 7 less. We hit the sinkhole slope and started up it, and the air changed, and I felt it before my mind could name it. Moving air. Cool air. And under the chemical and the copper and the spoiled meat stink of the deep mine, threaded through it, another smell entirely. Wet leaves, diesel, cold rain on stone, the smell of the surface, the smell of the living, breathing world up there past the portal. And it reached down that slope and hooked into all of us and pulled us up faster than any amount of fear ever could have driven us. Because fear pushes, but hope pulls, and hope pulls harder. And then, ahead of us in the dark, another light. Not one of ours. It came from the side, from the point where the number 2 panel rejoined the escapeway near the top, exactly where Garrett had said it would come out a lifetime ago at the empty cache. His light, bobbing, hurrying now. And above the light, the pale shape of a self-rescuer still strapped over his face. And in his hand, the black shape of our stolen radio. He was maybe 40 feet ahead of us, and 40 feet from the portal head and the manual release. And when his light swung and caught our lights coming up the slope behind him, I heard him make a sound through the rubber mouthpiece. A muffled, disbelieving, ragged sound. Because we were not supposed to be there. We were supposed to be dead in the dark, far behind him, or drowned in black damp, or torn apart in the escapeway. His numbers, his maps, his month of careful cold arithmetic had not accounted for one old air bridge and one forgotten phone, and a crew of men who went up and over the heads of the dead. He ran for the release. So did we. Del got there first, old Del Pretty, 59 years old, thin as a rail, who had already made his peace back in that little room, and so was the only one of us running toward the thing the rest of us were, deep down, still running away from. He hit the portal head 3 full steps ahead of Garrett Sable, and he threw his whole thin body onto the manual release. A big red-painted lever in a steel housing bolted to the frame, and he hauled it down and held it with everything he had left. His boots braced, his back bowed, his whole weight hanging on it. And up above us in the dark, I heard the gate stop. Heard the slow grind of its ceiling stop dead. And hold, open, held open by nothing in the world but one old man's weight on one steel lever. Garrett skidded to a stop on the wet stone. His light went to Del holding the gate open. Then it swung back to us. 6 men coming up the slope behind him. Close now, close enough to see the whites of his eyes over the mouthpiece. And I watched him understand, in about 1 single second, that everything had turned over. That the gate which was supposed to seal us in and let him alone slip out was now being held wide open by a man who was never, ever going to let go of it. And that between him and any quiet, solitary escape now stood 6 men who knew, every one of them, exactly what he had done and exactly what it had almost cost. He could have run through the gate. It was open. Dell was holding it. He could have gone through and kept running out to his timed ride and left every one of us behind. And that is precisely what a man who empties an emergency cache and steals a cruise radio and locks a door on 7 lives ought to do, right to the last. But he didn't. He turned around, standing there in the open mouth of the gate, our stolen radio in his hand, and he faced us. And he reached up and pulled the mouthpiece down off his mouth so we could hear him. And he said, "Wait, wait. There's room now. Dell's holding it. Look, he's holding it open. There's room. There's time. We can all get through. All of us. Come on." "Go," Dell said from the lever. His voice was strained tight with the whole weight of the gate hanging off his arms and his back. "Earl, everybody, go. Now. Right now. I can't hold this thing forever. My arms are going. Go." And here is the choice. The real one. The one that was actually mine to make, because the choice about the gate, Dell had already taken that one out of my hands and made it himself out of love. My choice was Garrett. Garrett Sable, standing in the open gate with our radio in his hand. The man who had tried to murder all of us with an empty steel box and a locked yellow door, now offering to walk out beside us into the rain like none of it had ever happened. My crew was coming up the slope behind me. Boone had a big pipe wrench in his fist that he'd caught up off the rack in the pump station without my ever seeing him do it. Rooster's huge hands were opening and closing at his sides. 6 men who had been sentenced to die in the dark by this one man not 30 minutes past. And here he stood, 1 step away, and the dark behind us was full of the turned dead climbing that slope, after our lights. And there was more than enough rage in that portal, God knows, to do a thing to Garrett Sable that no jury in West Virginia would ever have convicted a soul for. I would like to tell you I made the right choice for a noble reason, that I rose above it. The truth is smaller and colder than that, and I've decided over the years to tell it true. I looked at Garrett Sable in the gate, and I looked at the open gate itself. And I looked at Dell, straining on that lever with maybe seconds left in his old failing arms. And I understood, all at once, that every second we spent on Garrett Sable was a second stolen, straight out of Del Pretty's dying. Whatever that man in the gate had earned, taking it from him now would cost us the exact thing that Dell was giving up his life to hand us. Our anger would kill Dell's gift as surely as the sealing gate would. "Boone," I said, "drop the wrench. Everybody through. Now, go." "Earl." Boone's whole body was shaking with it, the wrench trembling in his grip. "He's not worth Dell's life. Not 1 second of it. Move through the gate, now." And we moved. We went past Garrett Sable, close enough that any one of us could have reached out and closed a hand on his throat. And not one man among us laid a finger on him. And I saw the look on his face go from readiness, because he had been braced for us to kill him. He had been standing there, ready to be beaten to death, and I think a part of him wanted it. I saw it go from that to something like fear, a deeper fear than any he'd shown all night, because he did not know what to do with men who would not do the thing he had earned. It unmade him somehow, our not touching him. We went through the gate, past Dell hanging on his lever, and every one of us as we passed reached out and put a hand flat on Dell's shoulder, one after another. And Dell said each of our names as we touched him. Quiet, like a benediction, like he was seeing each of us off. Trace, Sim, Rooster, Boone, Hollis. And when it was my turn, my hand on his thin, hard shoulder, I said, "I'll tell them, Dell, every one of them. I'll tell them what you did, and I'll tell them what he did, and I won't leave anything out." And Dell Pretty smiled and said, "I know you will, Earl. You always were a straight one. Now go on. Get on out of here and let me finish." Lieutenant Garrett came through the gate last. He came through because there was nothing left behind him now but the dark and the turned dead coming up the slope. And even a man like Garrett Sable will run from that. He came through right on my heels, and the very instant his boots cleared the frame, the very instant he was through, Dell Pretty let go of the lever. The gate came down, fast at the end, the way a thing that's been held falls the moment it's released. The whole weight of it dropping at once, and the steel locking bolts threw home into their keepers, with a sound like the mountain itself closing its jaw on the world. A sound I felt in my teeth and my chest and my back molars, final as anything I have ever heard. And Dell Pretty was on the wrong side of it, standing at the portal head in the sudden dark, with his hand still raised in the air from where the lever had been. And I saw him through the bars of the gate for just 1 second before the emergency lights inside the perimeter cut out. And he was smiling. That same terrible, peaceful smile. And behind him, down the slope, there were lights coming up out of the deep dark, flat and slow and many, more of them than I wanted to count. And then the lights inside went black, and I could not see Dell Pretty anymore. And I never saw him again. We came up out of that mountain into a cold, rainy night, out into the flashing red and blue strobe of Deputy Ansel Carraway's cruiser and 2 others, parked crooked on the hillside, out into a wet, dark world that was still, somehow, against all the promise of that night, standing and turning, and real. 6 of us. Boone with his head split and Trace shaking like a wet dog, and Sim and Rooster and Hollis, and me, and Garrett Sable, who came out of the gate last and walked away from the 6 of us, to stand alone in the rain with our stolen radio still hanging forgotten in his hand, saying nothing to any of us. And not one of us said a single word to him, because there was nothing left in any man among us to spend on Garrett Sable that night. They took Garrett into custody within the hour, not for what he'd done to us, not at first, because there is no law written down anywhere for a man emptying a cache of breathing units in a mine, no statute for stealing a crew's radio, no charge in the book for locking a door and doing arithmetic that leaves 7 men out of the answer. They took him because it came out fast, once the deputy started asking him ordinary questions, and his answers didn't hold. That Garrett Sable was not who he had said he was. That the name he'd hired on under at Blackwater 4 wasn't his own. That the wife's people from around Logan didn't exist. And that the people with a vehicle he'd been so anxious to signal from the portal were part of something the deputies got very quiet and careful about and would not discuss in front of us. Something that had been moving out ahead of the outbreak. Buying and selling ways out of it to men who could pay and had no love left for anyone but themselves. I gave my statement standing in the rain, with a blanket around my shoulders and my hands still shaking. I told them all of it. The phone that died mid-word, the warm water in the shaft, the empty steel box with its 12 perfect absences, the locked yellow door, the radio, the timed ride, the overcast, and Dell Pretty holding a red lever down with his failing arms in the dark, so that 6 men he had worked beside could walk back into the rain. I don't know for certain what became of Garrett Sable after that night. The outbreak got worse before it ever got better, a great deal worse, and in the churn of it, a lot of paperwork got lost, and a lot of men got moved around. And a lot of things that should have been remembered weren't. Men like Garrett have a way of walking out of the back of things while everyone's attention is on the front. I've thought about him more than I would ever want to admit to my wife or my priest. Not with hate, exactly. Though God knows there's hate in it. With something worse than hate. Something I've never found the right word for. With the memory of how completely ordinary he was. How he remembered my kids' names and asked after them by name. How he made the coffee just the way the day crew liked it. How he apologized to us and meant it. While he was sentencing 7 of us to die in the dark. Evil didn't come into that mind that night with fangs and red eyes. It came in with soft hands and a good memory and a plan a month in the making. And it wore the face of a man I would have trusted with my life. And did trust with my life. Right up until I stood over an empty box. And it cost me the best man I ever worked beside in 29 years underground. They never recovered Del Pretty. The Sinkhole portal is welded shut now, sealed for good. Part of a hot zone that a chain-link fence and a county ordinance keep the living world well back from. Somewhere down in that dark, near a red-painted lever, there's a man who spent 40 years underground and then, at the very end, got to choose the day and the reason he'd stay there for good. I took the laminated photograph of his wife, the little one that used to ride inside the crown of his hard hat, and I had it framed, and I hung it up on the wall of the Union Hall. And every man who walks past it now knows the whole story from beginning to end. Because I made good on what I told Del through the bars of that gate. I told them all of it. I never left anything out. Not the box, not the door, not the radio. Not one thing Garrett Sable did. And not one thing Del Pretty did either. Here is the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I most want to leave with you before I let you go. We spend all of our fear on the wrong dangers. We lie awake picturing the swarm, the teeth, the thing in the dark that wants to open us up and eat us alive. But the dark didn't take Del Pretty from us. A man did. A quiet, pleasant, careful man who ran his numbers and decided, calmly, a month in advance, that some lives were staging and some lives were cargo and some lives were simply left out of the answer. And who made his peace with all of it long before the phone ever went dead mid-word. The turned men down in that escape way, the poor ruined souls I'd traded nods with that same afternoon, they could not so much as work a door bolt. Garrett Sable could work a door bolt just fine. He could empty a cache and time a gate and swing a radio like a club and apologize while he did it. And that, in the end, after everything, is the only thing left down in that mountain that I am still truly afraid of. If this story stayed with you, if you felt that gate come down the way I still feel it, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. 'Cause I read them, all of them. And it helps more than you'd ever think a thing like that could. And ask yourself the question I have never once been able to answer for myself, all these years later. 6 men walked out of that mountain because one old man chose to stay behind and die holding a door. And one man tried his level best to make sure that not one of us ever walked out at all. And then walked out himself anyway, clean into the rain. And I let him. I stood one step away from him with my crew and a pipe wrench and a whole night's worth of rage, and I let him walk. If you'd been standing at that gate with the rain coming down, and the man who'd tried to murder you 1 arm's length away, and no law in the world close enough to matter, what would you have done with Garrett Sable? Because I made my choice in half a second, in the dark, with an old man dying behind me. And I have had every single night since to lie awake and wonder whether I got it right. I still don't know. Maybe you can tell me. I'd honestly like to hear it.